The day Don Aldo Ferrante walked into the South Naples office with a woman nobody had ever seen before, 3 of his most senior men stopped talking mid-sentence. Not because she was beautiful. Not because she was dangerous looking. Because she was neither, and Don Aldo Ferrante never brought anyone into that office who was neither. Her name was Elena Russo. She was 34 years old. She wore a blue cardigan that had been washed too many times, carried a thermos of chamomile tea in her left hand and 2 thick notebooks pressed against her right arm. She was heavy-set, soft-faced, with dark eyes that moved across a room the way a camera lens moves, slowly, completely, missing nothing. She did not smile when she was introduced. She nodded once. Then she sat down at the small desk near the window and opened the first notebook. Don Aldo did not explain her presence. He never explained anything. He simply said, "Elena handles my paperwork," and walked into his private office and closed the door. That was it. That was the entire introduction. The men looked at each other. Carlo Bianchi, who had been with the Ferrante organization for 19 years and believed he had seen everything worth seeing, leaned toward his colleague Piero and whispered, "Paperwork." Piero nodded slowly. "Paperwork," he agreed, in the tone of a man who understood that the word meant something else entirely and had no idea what. Nobody asked Don Aldo. You did not ask Don Aldo Ferrante questions about his decisions. You accepted them. You worked around them. You waited until the reason became obvious, because his reasons always became obvious eventually, usually at a moment when it was too late to be surprised. The office was a converted shipping company on the edge of the harbor. It smelled like salt water and old wood and, now, faintly of chamomile tea. Elena worked at her desk from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, Monday through Saturday. She did not gossip. She did not eat lunch with the men. She brought her own food in a small container, ate at her desk, and returned to her notebooks without pause. The notebooks were the first thing everyone noticed. She always had 2 of them. One was for writing in. The other one nobody ever saw her open. It sat on the left corner of her desk like a closed door, and something about the way it sat there made men uncomfortable without knowing why. Within the first week, Don Aldo issued his rule. He called the 3 senior men into his office on a Thursday afternoon. Carlo, Piero, and a younger capo named Damian Holt, who had transferred from the northern operations 6 months prior and was still figuring out how things worked in the south. Don Aldo stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking at the harbor. He did not turn around when they came in. "Elena Russo," he said, "is not to be addressed casually. She is not to be talked to about things that are not her direct business. You will not make jokes near her. You will not invite her into your conversations. You will not look at her the way men look at women they have decided do not matter." He paused. The harbor light moved across the floor. "This is not a request." Carlo was the one who almost said something. You could see it in his face, the small tension around his mouth, the breath he drew in. But 19 years had taught him that the breath was enough. He let it out slowly and nodded instead. Damian Holt, who was only 31 and had not yet learned what a breath drawn at the wrong moment could cost him, kept his expression perfectly neutral. He was good at that. He had a face that showed nothing, which was part of why he had risen quickly and part of why he was also, in small ways, beginning to believe he was smarter than the men above him. He was not. But he did not know that yet. They left Don Aldo's office and said nothing to each other in the hallway. That evening, in the bar 3 blocks away that served as the organization's informal gathering place, the conversation happened the way conversations always happen when powerful men feel they cannot speak directly. "Old man's going soft," said one of the younger soldiers, a man named Leo Fitch, who had a talent for saying out loud what everyone else was thinking and absolutely no talent for knowing when saying it out loud was a bad idea. Nobody corrected him. Nobody agreed with him either. They drank their drinks and looked at the table. Damian Holt was there, sitting slightly apart the way he always did, close enough to listen, far enough to maintain the idea that he was not quite part of whatever was happening. He said nothing. But he watched Leo Fitch with the careful, measuring look of someone who was already filing the comment away for future use. Elena, of course, was not there. She was never there. She went home at 6, and whatever she did between 6 in the evening and 8 in the morning was a complete mystery to every single person in the organization. Some men had tried to find out. They discovered that she lived in a small apartment above a bakery on the Via Mergellina, that she bought the same groceries every Wednesday, that she walked to and from work regardless of weather, and that she had no visible friends, no family in the city, and no social life that anyone could identify. This, combined with the rule, made her interesting in the way that locked rooms are interesting. The less accessible a thing is, the more space it takes up in the mind. But the men were busy. There were shipments to manage, disputes to resolve, money to move quietly from one place to another. Elena Russo and her notebooks and her rule were a background detail, strange, yes, but not urgent. That was the first mistake. The second mistake came 4 days later, when Leo Fitch needed a document from the filing cabinet near Elena's desk and, not finding her there, helped himself to the cabinet without thinking. He found what he needed. He also, without meaning to, without even realizing it, brushed one of her notebooks off the edge of the desk with his elbow. It hit the floor. Leo picked it up. He set it back on the desk. He did not open it. He genuinely did not think to open it. He was not curious that way. He just set it back down and left. When Elena returned 20 minutes later, she sat at her desk, looked at the notebook's position, and was still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in the open notebook, the writing one, and turned the page and continued her work. Leo Fitch had no idea anything had happened. Don Aldo, arriving later that afternoon and passing Elena's desk on his way to his office, glanced at the open notebook on her desk. Elena didn't look up. She just turned the notebook slightly, a half-inch rotation, so the page faced outward. Don Aldo read the single line she had written. His expression did not change. He walked into his office. He closed the door. That night, Leo Fitch received a phone call. He was not fired. He was not threatened. He was simply reassigned to a different location, far enough away that he would not be passing Elena's desk anymore. The call was brief and polite. Leo accepted it without argument because there was no argument to make. He didn't even know what he had done. The rest of the men noticed the reassignment, of course. Men in that kind of organization always notice reassignments. They connected it, vaguely, to the rule. They became more careful. Not because they understood, they didn't, but because caution was the one instinct that had kept most of them alive, and it worked even when applied blindly. Elena arrived the next morning at 5 minutes to 8. Chamomile tea. 2 notebooks. Blue cardigan, this time a slightly different shade. She sat down. She opened the first notebook. She had been with Don Aldo Ferrante for 11 days. Nobody had learned anything yet. But the notebooks had. That was the thing about Elena Russo that took people too long to understand. She was not gathering information the way most people in that world gathered information, through pressure, through fear, through networks of people who owed favors. She was gathering it the way water gathers in a low place, slowly, without effort, simply by being where information naturally ran. The men talked in the office. They talked on the phones near her desk. They talked in the hallway with the door open because she was just the woman with the thermos and nobody thought twice about it. They argued about numbers in front of her because she was just writing in her notebook and clearly not listening. They made arrangements, cancelled arrangements, changed arrangements, all within 15 feet of a woman who forgot nothing and wrote down the things that mattered and kept the notebook that held those things on the left corner of her desk where nobody ever touched it. Don Aldo had found her 3 years before any of the current men had met her. He had found her, specifically, through a problem. The problem was this: his previous 3-year financial review had shown a clean set of books. Clean in a way that was too clean. Clean in the way that only happens when someone very careful has made something look clean that is not. His accountants had reviewed everything and found nothing wrong. The federal investigators who had been circling the organization for a year and a half had found nothing wrong either. Don Aldo himself had looked at the numbers and felt something, not a specific thing, just a feeling, the kind that had kept him alive and in charge for 22 years, and he did not trust them. He hired Elena Russo on the recommendation of a man he trusted in Rome. She was not an accountant. She was not an investigator. She was described to him simply as someone who sees things. Don Aldo, who valued results over credentials, brought her in. She asked for 48 hours, 3 years of financial records, and a pot of chamomile tea. He provided all 3. She came back at the 36-hour mark. She sat across from him and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. On it were 7 names, 4 account numbers, and a notation of exactly $2.3 million that had moved from his organization into someone else's pocket over 18 months. Disguised across 41 transactions as a combination of administrative fees, maintenance costs, and a string of small charitable donations that looked, individually, completely legitimate. Don Aldo looked at the sheet of paper for a long time. Then he looked at Elena. "How?" he said. "The charitable donations," she said. The amounts were slightly irregular. Not random, irregular in a specific pattern. Each donation was an exact percentage of the previous month's revenue. Nobody does that accidentally. If you give to charity by accident, the amounts are truly random. If the amounts follow a formula, someone is doing math. He thought about that. My 3 accountants didn't see it. Your 3 accountants were looking for what was missing, she said. I was looking for what was there that shouldn't be. She accepted the tea he offered her and went home. Don Aldo spent the rest of that week resolving the situation quietly. 3 people left the organization. The charitable donations stopped. The $2.3 million was never recovered, but the mechanism that had been extracting it was gone, and Don Aldo made peace with the loss because the alternative, not knowing, was worse. He called Elena 6 weeks later and offered her a permanent position. She asked 3 questions: whether she would have her own desk, whether she could bring her own tea, and whether anyone would go through her materials without her permission. He said yes, yes, and no. She started the following Monday. The rule came 18 days after she started. 18 days was how long it took Don Aldo to understand that the men were already treating her the way men in that environment inevitably treated women they had decided were unimportant. And the problem was not the disrespect itself. Don Aldo was not a sentimental man, and fairness as a concept interested him less than function. The problem was that every time a man dismissed Elena Russo, he was also, without knowing it, telling her things. Casual things. Careless things. The kinds of things people say when they believe no one significant is listening. Don Aldo understood this the morning he overheard Carlo Bianchi talking on the phone 3 feet from Elena's desk about a delivery schedule that was supposed to be known only to 4 people, one of whom was not Carlo. He understood it completely in that moment. The men were not being careless around Elena. They were being careless around what they thought Elena was. The rule was not about protecting her dignity. The rule was about protecting the integrity of the information she was collecting. Every casual conversation, every careless exchange, every half-sentence spoken in her presence, Elena absorbed it, filtered it, and added it to a picture that was becoming, month by month, more complete than anything Don Aldo's surveillance operations had ever produced. If the men respected her, really respected her, the way they respected each other, they would have been careful around her. And careful men gave nothing away. Don Aldo needed them to be careless. He just needed them to be careless in a direction he could use. But there was a balance. If they actively bothered her, involved her in their conversations, drew her into their world, she would stop being invisible to them and start being a person they paid attention to. That was also dangerous, for different reasons. So the rule was precisely calibrated: do not engage with her, do not disrespect her, do not treat her as part of your social world at all. Leave her alone. Pretend she is furniture that occasionally makes chamomile tea. The men thought the rule was eccentric. It was, in fact, a masterpiece. And it worked for 3 years without a single problem. Until Damien Holt decided, quietly and entirely on his own, that he was ready to be more than a capo. Damien was not stupid. That was the important thing to understand about him. Stupid men make mistakes loudly and early. Damien made his mistakes quietly and late, which is much more dangerous because by the time anyone notices, the consequences are already in motion. He had been watching the organization's finances for 18 months, not because anyone asked him to, but because he was building a picture. He was patient. He was careful. He was, in his own estimation, the most capable person in the room at any given moment. He was also, quietly, in contact with a rival group out of Rome, a smaller operation that had been trying for years to establish a foothold in the South Naples shipping lanes. They had approached him 8 months ago through an intermediary. He had said nothing for 2 months. Then he had said a small yes, which led to a slightly larger yes, which led to a series of conversations that he was absolutely certain were untraceable. They were not untraceable. But he didn't know that yet. What he did know, or believed, was that Elena Russo was a distraction. A pet project of an aging boss who had surrounded himself with loyal people instead of capable ones. He had watched her for months. She sat at her desk. She wrote in her notebook. She drank her tea. She handed Don Aldo papers occasionally. She was, in Damien's assessment, a secretary who had managed to make herself seem important through proximity. He had never once considered the possibility that the person in the room who understood the most about everything happening in that office was the woman everyone had been instructed to ignore. That was his fundamental mistake. Not the contact with Rome. Not the slow repositioning of his loyalties. Those were dangerous, but they were recoverable mistakes in theory. The mistake that would undo him was the morning he walked past Elena's desk, glanced down at the open notebook, and picked it up. He told himself he was curious. He told himself it was just a notebook. He told himself that Don Aldo's rules were for the soldiers, not for the capos. He read 3 lines. Just 3. Then he put it down and walked to his office. Elena had been in the small back room making tea when it happened. She came back 2 minutes later. She sat down. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the position of the pen she always left across the open page. The pen had moved 1/4 of an inch. She picked up her pen. She opened the second notebook, the one nobody ever saw her open, for the first time in 6 weeks. She wrote 1 line. She closed it. She put it back on the left corner of her desk. Then she continued her morning as though nothing had happened at all. Because nothing had happened yet. The thing was already done. Don Aldo received the page on a Thursday. Elena had walked into his office at 4:30, placed it on his desk without comment, and returned to her desk before he had even picked it up. He read it standing. The page listed 6 separate contacts between Damien Holt and a man named Paul Garrett, who was the southern representative of the Rome operation. It listed the approximate dates of those contacts, reconstructed from a combination of financial irregularities, small ones, the kind only Elena would notice, and 3 overheard phone calls, 2 of which had happened within 10 feet of her desk while Damien spoke quietly in what he believed was low enough a voice to not matter. There were also 2 lines at the bottom of the page. One noted that Damien had accessed her open notebook 3 weeks prior. The second noted the single piece of information he would have seen, a reference to a shipment scheduled for the following month, with a port listed. The port on the page was not the real port. Elena had changed it. She had changed it 6 days before Damien touched the notebook, in the second day of a week when she had noticed him watching her desk with a slightly different kind of attention. She had not told Don Aldo about the change. She had simply made it. Then she waited. Don Aldo set the page down. He sat behind his desk. He was quiet for nearly a minute. Then he poured 2 glasses of wine from the bottle on the shelf behind him. He walked to Elena's desk and placed one in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I don't drink while I'm working." She picked up her thermos and took a sip of chamomile tea. Don Aldo stood there for a moment with a wine glass in each hand. Then he put both glasses back on his desk and went and sat down. Carlo Bianchi, who had witnessed this from the hallway through the half-open door, turned around and walked very quietly in the other direction. He told Piero about it that evening. Piero said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She changed the port, didn't she?" Carlo thought about it. She must have. They drank their drinks. The following week, a shipment arrived at the wrong port, the port on the page, and was met by 4 men from the Rome operation who had been told, by someone they trusted, exactly when and where to be. They found an empty dock. 2 shipping containers filled with kitchen appliances. A port official who had no idea what they were looking for. Paul Garrett called his contact in Naples to find out what had happened. His contact in Naples, Damien Holt, had no answer. Because Damien had no idea what had happened either. He had passed along exactly what he had seen. He had been certain it was accurate. The notebook had been open. The information had been there. He had read it with his own eyes. He spent 3 days quietly trying to work out whether the information had changed after he saw it, or whether he had misread it, or whether someone had known he was going to look. None of the 3 possibilities were comfortable. The third one was the one that kept him up at night, because the third one meant that someone had seen him seeing it, and that meant someone had been watching him, and if someone had been watching him then everything else was also exposed, and if everything else was also exposed then he was in a position that no amount of careful thinking was going to fix. He went to the office on a Wednesday morning and sat at his desk and tried to behave normally. He was good at behaving normally. He had always been good at that. Elena was at her desk. Thermos. 2 notebooks. Blue cardigan. She was writing something in the open one. She did not look up when he came in. He sat at his desk. He answered 2 phone calls. He reviewed some papers. He drank his coffee. At 11:15, Don Aldo's assistant came to his door and said, quietly, that Don Aldo would like to see him. Damien straightened his jacket. He walked to Don Aldo's office. He knocked. He went in. Don Aldo was sitting behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface. There was nothing on the desk except a single sheet of paper, which Don Aldo did not touch while Damien entered, did not gesture toward, did not explain. He simply looked at Damien for a moment and then said, "Sit down." Damien sat. Don Aldo said, "I'm going to ask you one question. I want you to think carefully before you answer it, because the answer you give me will determine what happens next, and I want the space between my question and your answer to be as clean as possible." Damien waited. "How many times," Don Aldo said, "did you speak to Paul Garrett?" The silence in the room was total. There was no traffic noise from outside, no creak of the building, no sound of voices in the hallway. Just the question, sitting in the air between them. Damien's first instinct was to say, "I don't know who Paul Garrett is." He had the sentence ready. He had rehearsed a version of it months ago, in the early days when he was first considering the contact, because you always rehearse the denials before you need them. But he looked at Don Aldo's hands flat on the desk. He looked at the single sheet of paper. He thought about the wrong port. He thought about the open notebook. He thought about Elena Russo sitting at her desk 11 days after she had arrived and already writing Leo Fitch's name in a notebook that resulted in Leo Fitch getting relocated without knowing why. He thought about 3 years of that. 6 times, Damien said. Don Aldo nodded once. He picked up the sheet of paper and placed it in a drawer. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the harbor. You will finish the week, he said. On Friday you will receive your final payment. On Saturday you will not come in. We will not discuss this again, and neither will you, with anyone, about anything. Damien sat very still. That's all? Don Aldo did not turn around. You were honest just now. That has value. He paused. Also, you touched something that wasn't yours. You know what you found when you did that. Damien did know. He had found nothing, a false port, a dead end, a trap laid so quietly that he had walked into it without even understanding it was there. Not a trap set by Don Aldo. A trap set by a woman in a blue cardigan who had noticed a quarter-inch shift in her pen and known exactly what it meant. He stood. He adjusted his jacket again, because it was the only thing he could think to do with his hands. He walked to the door. Don Aldo said, without turning around, don't take anything from the office when you leave. Damien left. He walked past Elena's desk. She was writing in her open notebook. She did not look up. The second notebook sat on the left corner of her desk, closed and still. He went to his own desk and sat down and stared at his hands for a long time. By Friday evening, Damien Holt was gone. No announcement. No explanation. His desk was cleared before anyone came in on Saturday morning, and by Monday it was occupied by a man named Graham Cole who had transferred up from the coastal operation and who would spend his first 3 days in the office trying to figure out who the woman with the thermos was and why nobody would explain the unspoken rules about her. Carlo Bianchi was the one who told him. Not everything, nobody told anyone everything about Elena. But the surface rules. Don't engage. Don't disrespect. Don't leave things on her desk or take things from it. Don't speak about things you don't want remembered in her presence. Graham Cole said, she's that important? Carlo looked at him for a moment. She's that accurate, he said, and walked away, which was not quite an answer to the question Graham had asked but was, in fact, the more useful information. The federal investigation that had been tracking the Ferrante organization's financial movements for 2.5 years concluded that same month without charges. The investigators had spent 8 months building a case around a particular set of financial connections that had quietly ceased to exist 6 months earlier, reconstructed through a series of small, legal adjustments that had made the paper trail evaporate without removing a single document. Investigators cannot build a case around something that is no longer there. The case was closed. None of the men in the organization knew exactly what Elena had done. Don Aldo knew. He said nothing about it except to deposit an additional sum into an account whose number only he and Elena knew existed. She continued to arrive at 5 minutes to 8. Chamomile tea. 2 notebooks. The same blue cardigan, or one so similar it made no difference. The organization began to change in small ways after Damien's departure. Men were more careful near her desk. Not because they understood, most of them still didn't, but because enough things had happened quietly enough times that being careful around Elena Russo had become instinct. The way it becomes instinct to step around a particular patch of floor when you've slipped on it once and seen others slip on it since. Graham Cole, who was sharp and paid attention, began to understand faster than most. Within 3 months he had a working theory of what Elena was, and he was mostly correct. He kept the theory to himself, which was itself evidence that he was smarter than his predecessor in that desk. The older men, Carlo, Piero, a few others who had been around since before Elena arrived, had their own relationship with her, which was not exactly respect in the conventional sense and not exactly fear either. It was something more like the feeling a sailor has about the ocean. You don't disrespect it. You don't challenge it. You work with it when it's calm and you pay attention when it isn't, and you never, under any circumstances, forget that it is larger than you and has been there longer and will be there after you're gone. Piero, who had a poetic streak he usually kept hidden, once described Elena to Carlo as the memory the organization has of itself. Carlo thought about that for a while. Then he said, more like the memory it has of everyone else, and Piero agreed that was closer. Don Aldo's health had begun to show small signs of slowing, nothing dramatic, nothing that affected his authority or his clarity, but the kind of slowing that observant people notice and pretend not to. He walked slightly more deliberately than he had 5 years before. He took longer to respond to things in the mornings. He kept a glass of water on his desk now, where he had never bothered with water before. The men noticed. They always noticed. And in the slow, quiet way that power structures begin to prepare themselves for shifts, the conversations about succession had started, not openly, not anywhere near Don Aldo's range of hearing, but in the bar 3 blocks away, over drinks, in the way men float names and watch to see how they land. Elena noticed too. She noticed the conversations without hearing most of them, the same way she had always gathered information, through pattern, through the small gaps between things, through what changed and what didn't. She wrote nothing about it in either notebook. That was not her area. Her area was the information that kept the organization functioning and the information that threatened it. Who would run it after Don Aldo was a question for the men who cared about that question. She refilled her thermos and turned the page. Don Aldo came in one Tuesday morning in November looking slightly tired. He sat at his desk and worked through his papers. At 11, he called Elena into his office. He had a set of financial documents from a new potential partnership, a legitimate shipping company in Palermo that wanted a relationship with certain distribution networks in Naples. "Look at these," he said. She looked at them for 22 minutes while he answered his phone calls. Then she put them back on his desk in a neat stack and said, "The managing director of the Palermo company is related by marriage to a man who testified in the Rome investigation 4 years ago. The relationship isn't listed anywhere obvious. It took me a moment to find the connection." Don Aldo put his phone down. "Should I be concerned?" "Probably not," she said. "The marriage was distant and the testimony was unrelated to anything near this. But you should know it's there." He looked at her. "How did you find that in 22 minutes from a set of corporate documents?" "The Palermo company's registered address," she said. "I recognized the street from something I read 3 years ago. It made me look at the director's name more carefully." "3 years ago," he repeated. "I have a good memory." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elena, I want to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago." She waited. "Do you like this work?" She considered the question carefully, the way she considered everything. "I find it interesting," she said. "Most of what I do is look at things until I understand them. I've always found that satisfying." "Even here? In this kind of organization?" She met his eyes. "Information doesn't have a conscience, Don Aldo. It's just information. What you do with it is your business." She paused. "I make sure you have accurate information. What you do with that accuracy is yours." He nodded slowly. "And if I did something with it that troubled you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I suppose I would know before you did." He almost laughed. It was the closest she had ever come to a joke in 3 years. She went back to her desk. He sat with the Palermo documents for a while, not reading them, thinking about the woman at the desk outside his door who had a good memory and had been with him long enough to know more about his organization than most of the people who ran parts of it. He thought about what it would mean when the succession conversations that he wasn't supposed to know about eventually became real, for those men to have Elena on their side or not on their side. He thought about that for a long time. Then he called his financial officer and told him to process a salary adjustment for Elena Russo, effective immediately, doubling her current rate. The financial officer made a quiet sound of acknowledgement and said nothing else, because by now everyone had learned that comments about Elena Russo's compensation were not a productive use of anyone's time. The news moved through the organization the way all news moved, without anyone officially announcing it, through the small seams between people who were not supposed to be talking to each other. Graham Cole heard about it from Carlo, who heard it from the financial officer's assistant. He sat with the information for a moment. Then he said, "She asked for a raise?" "First time in 3 years," Carlo said. Graham thought about what it meant that the first raise Elena Russo had ever asked for was the one that got approved at double the amount without a single conversation about whether it was appropriate. "Good for her," he said. Carlo nodded. He meant it. They both meant it. That was the thing that had changed, quietly, in the months since Damien Holt's desk had been cleared and Graham Cole had sat down at it and paid enough attention to understand who was actually keeping things running. The mockery had stopped. It had not stopped because of a new rule or a meeting or a speech. It had stopped the way all things stop when the evidence against them becomes impossible to ignore. Man after man in that organization had eventually encountered some version of the same moment, a situation that could have gone wrong, that didn't, a mistake that should have been costly, that was somehow already addressed, a threat that appeared on Don Aldo's radar before it fully formed, contained and redirected before it became a problem. And at the center of each of those moments, if you looked carefully enough, was a single sheet of paper that had moved from Elena's desk to Don Aldo's. Nobody declared her important. Nobody made a statement. They simply stopped treating her the way they had treated her at the beginning, the way men treat women they have decided do not matter, because it had become quietly, undeniably clear that Elena Russo mattered more than almost anyone else in the room. She did not acknowledge the change. She did not acknowledge the raise. She arrived the Monday after it was processed at 5 minutes to 8, put her thermos on the desk, opened her notebook, and continued exactly where she had left off. She had been writing in the same notebook for 6 weeks. The previous one sat in the drawer to her left. The second notebook sat on the right corner of her desk now, the closed one, the one nobody ever saw her open. It had moved from the left corner to the right corner. Nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't say anything, because by now they had learned that Elena's habits were not accidents and questioning them was not productive. The notebook had moved because there was more to write in it now. The succession conversations had progressed. 3 names had begun to surface consistently in the bar 3 blocks away. Don Aldo's eventual stepping back was not imminent, but it was no longer inconceivable, and men who were not inconceivable about power were beginning to position themselves with that future in mind. One of those 3 names, Elena had determined, was also quietly routing money in a way that would become a problem within approximately 14 months if it continued. Not for Don Aldo, the amounts were too small to affect him directly. But for the man himself, when the amounts stopped being small. It always started small. She had written 4 lines about it in the second notebook. 4 lines, no names yet. She was still verifying. She would be ready when it mattered. There was, in the final weeks of that year, a moment that became the story the older men told afterward, the moment that solidified what Elena Russo meant to the organization in a way that no amount of quiet evidence had quite managed. A new associate arrived. His name was Connor Webb, and he was 26 years old, transferred from a smaller operation up the coast at the recommendation of a man Don Aldo trusted. He was quick and confident and had done good work, and he carried himself with the energy of someone who knew he had done good work and expected to be recognized for it. He arrived on a Wednesday. He was introduced around. He shook hands. He said the right things. He was taken to his desk, which was in the main room, and he sat down and looked around at the office with the measuring gaze of a young man calculating where he stood in the hierarchy. His eyes landed on Elena. She was at her desk. Thermos. Notebooks. Blue cardigan. He turned to the man next to him, a junior associate named Neil, who had been in the organization 8 months and had learned exactly enough to know what he didn't know, and said, under his breath, in the tone of a person making an observation they consider entirely harmless, "Who's the woman? The one with the tea?" He said it quietly. He was not trying to be disrespectful. He genuinely just wanted to know who she was. Neil opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Connor with an expression that was difficult to describe, not alarm exactly, but something in that neighborhood, the look of someone watching a person about to step onto ice they cannot see. Across the room, Carlo Bianchi had gone still. Graham Cole looked up from his desk. Piero, who was pouring coffee near the back, stopped pouring. Nobody said anything. Elena was writing in her open notebook. She did not look up. Connor noticed the stillness. He looked around. "What?" he said. Graham Cole stood up, walked over, and put a hand on Connor's shoulder in a way that was friendly but also very firmly steered him 2 steps further away from Elena's desk. He kept his voice low. "Elena Russo," he said. "She handles Don Aldo's administrative and analytical work. She has been with the organization for 3 years. Don Aldo has a standing instruction about her, which I will explain to you in full detail over coffee. Right now." Connor looked at the serious faces around the room. He looked at Elena's desk. She was still writing. The second notebook sat on the right corner of her desk, closed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. Graham considered the question. "No," he said. "But it's important that you understand something before you accidentally do." They went for coffee. Elena turned a page in her open notebook. She had not written anything in it in the past 4 minutes. Now she wrote 1 line, read it back, and then crossed it out. She crossed it out because Connor Webb had been steered away before he did anything that needed recording. He had asked a question. That was all. He was young and new and didn't know yet. The line she had written was not needed. She crossed it out and kept it there, the crossed out line, because the notebook was a record and even things that turned out not to matter were part of the record. She refilled her thermos. She opened the second notebook to a fresh page, considered it for a moment, and then closed it again without writing anything. Not yet. There was nothing yet that needed the second notebook. But there would be. There always was. Don Aldo passed her desk at the end of that day on his way out. He paused, the way he occasionally paused, not quite stopping, not quite in a hurry. He looked at the notebooks on her desk with the specific kind of look that was not reading them, just acknowledging they were there. Elena was putting her pen in her bag. She looked up. "Anything I need to know today," he said. "Connor Webb is going to be fine," she said. "Give him 2 weeks." Don Aldo nodded. He walked out. Elena put on her coat. She picked up her thermos. She tucked both notebooks, the open one and the closed one, into her bag. She did this every evening. The notebooks did not stay in the office overnight. She walked out into the harbor evening, the salt smell of the water coming in off the bay, the lights of the buildings going gold as the sky went dark. She walked the same route she always walked. She stopped at the same bakery she always stopped at, bought the same bread she always bought, climbed the same stairs to her apartment above it. She put the thermos in the kitchen. She set the notebooks on the small table by the window. She made real tea now, not chamomile, strong black tea the way she actually liked it, and she sat by the window and looked at the city, and for a while she did not think about numbers or patterns or the small discrepancies that meant large things. She just drank her tea. Tomorrow she would go back. She would open the notebooks. She would listen to men who didn't know they were being listened to, and she would watch for the things that were there that shouldn't be, and she would write them down in the way that made them useful, and the organization would continue to function with a precision that none of the men inside it could fully explain. None of them would ever understand it completely. Not even Don Aldo, and he understood more than anyone. The only one who understood it completely was Elena. She refilled her tea. She opened the second notebook to the 4 lines she had written about the money that was moving in a direction it shouldn't. She read them. She thought. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a 5th line. The city went quiet outside the window. The notebook sat open on the table, patient and full. Elena Russo finished her tea, closed both notebooks, and went to bed. She would be at her desk at 5 minutes to 8. She was always at her desk at 5 minutes to 8. And the things she knew would be there waiting too, exactly where she left them, exactly as accurate as they had always been. That was the thing about Elena. She never forgot anything. And she was never, ever wrong.